next presenter is Melissa Gengler. She's the owner and president of Historic Resources Group, also known as HRG, in Lincoln, Nebraska, I believe? Yes, right, which she founded in 2010. Melissa has 30 years of experience in the field of historic preservation. She has spent extensive time researching, surveying, and evaluating historic resources across the Midwest region. Prior to establishing HRG, Melissa worked for the State Historic Preservation offices in Nebraska and in South Dakota. She received Bachelor of Science degrees just down the road here at Southeast Missouri in Historic Preservation and a Master of Arts degree in History with a focus on the history of architecture in the United States. Melissa has worked with the National Park Service on St. Genevieve's Beauvais Amaro, Jean-Baptiste Vallée, theDelassus-Kern, and Janice Ziegler houses, as well as the old courthouse in St. Louis. Please join me in welcoming Melissa Dirr Gengler, who will present The Enigma of New Bourbon, History of the DeLassus House. Thank you.
Okay. I hope everybody can hear me. If there's a problem in the back, just raise your hand and I'll try to speak up or speak clearly. You're doing, oh, okay, great, thank you. This property has intrigued me since we've started working on it, and I wanted to expand a little bit on what our role is here in St. Genevieve. As you know, I went to school here in Missouri, well, Southeast Missouri State, and am very involved in the Alumni Association there, particularly for the Historic Preservation program. And of course, during that time, there were a lot of studies and a lot of work here in St. Genevieve. A lot of that was done, though, after I left the university there. But St. Genevieve has always been such a special place. And when I had the opportunity to become part of a project team that's working on these properties for the National Park Service, I was very excited about it. So it's been a fabulous 4 years or so, particularly getting to know Bob and really getting to know the families and the people that made St. Genevieve. It is such a special place, and researching here is like nothing else. So as a bit of an explanation, the projects that we're doing for the National Park Service are called Historic Structures Reports, or HSRs for short. And the project team consists of not only a historian, myself, to sort of provide a general overall context and a history so that we understand these buildings and recognize the history of these buildings, but it's also comprised of architects and engineers, wood specialists. So these will be technical documents that will provide plans, suggestions for rehabilitation, stabilization, accessibility. So once these documents are all done, they will be available to the public. And my small role in it is a historian to help document what we know about these buildings and how we can understand what they look like today versus what they looked like historically, and what sort of mysteries they have for us. And this, when Bob asked if I wanted to talk, which thank you, Bob, I said right away, no, I want to talk about the Kern House, as we shortly call it the Kern House, the DeLassus-Kern House. So thank you for inviting me today. I appreciate it. I love St. Genevieve. When I touched base with my husband yesterday, though, as you all know, I'm from Lincoln, Nebraska, his biggest concern was where I was going to be able to watch the game tonight, because he didn't think anybody was going to have Nebraska football. He's like, you better be careful, because they may not like it if you ask for Nebraska football when you're on the yeah, there you go. Yes, we have a DeLassus family member who is from the Omaha area here today. So thank you for inviting me. And I was reminded last night at the reception of what a special and intriguing place St. Genevieve is. And after talking with many of you and discussing the property with family members and family descendants, my hope is that, first of all, you will all tolerate my French pronunciation. I'm just going to apologize to you right away. And enjoy the information presented here. I hope it gives you something to think about and to appreciate in a new way, because I may not be able to provide you definitive answers as part of this presentation. Okay, next. Pierre Charles de Halt de Lassus and later Delassus, and Saint Vrain is in there as well. Delassus was added to his name after he acquired an estate with that name. Was born in 1738 in Bourbon, France. Here he met and married his wife Domitille, and they and their family left France to escape the French Revolution in 1790. There are many trails to this story to research, and it is definitely a rabbit hole that's very easily to go down. So we're going to try to keep this discussion just at the history of the house and what we know about it, with full recognition that this area, the rich history in this area, is documented in many places. This will provide an overview of the residence itself and the possible connections to Delassus. The question, is this the Delassus or portions of the Delassus house, may never be proven through the historical record. A link between the house in its existing form and Delassus has not been directly established through documents or archaeology, but the siting of the house on Delassus' land grant and the proximity of the house to New Bourbon create a historical link between the house and Delassus that is significant. So let's look a little closer at what we know and what we think. The requisite map, I would concur, we all know where we are, but just in case, the house stands in New Bourbon, or what's left of New Bourbon, about approximately 2 miles south of St. Genevieve on Highway 61. The blue star at the bottom indicates the location of the residence today. Delassus was a staunch monarchist and dedicated to the Bourbon family, and King Louis XVI particularly. He was a knight in the Royal Order of St. Michael or St. Michel and was inducted by King Louis himself at Versailles in 1786. His dedication to the monarchy, France's royalist system of government, and the Bourbon family particularly, would later wield significant influence not only in St. Genevieve, but the fledgling American Republic. His life in the New World was a physical and financial struggle from the moment he chose to leave France. He, his wife, and daughter arrived through Philadelphia in 1790, where he was forced to pay an extra sum to disembark from the boat, likely due to the increased number of people in his party and the excessive possessions he carried with him. He was an aristocrat in France, and he had a lovely landed estate, and he had a lot of stuff. And he could not decide what to bring with him to the New World. So he defaulted to as much as possible. Among his possessions were a harp, French millstones that he planned to use to create new or to build new mills across and along the river. He had extensive silverware, a large library, a huge collection of books, furnishings, and clothing. They were, however, sorely disappointed when a land grant scam from the Scioto Company proved a folly, and the 2,000 acres of land Delassus thought he purchased the rights to did not actually exist. So he and his family landed in the country with really nothing to their names and already in debt because of the extra fees just to get off of the boat when they did arrive. He and many others were victims of these companies and scams who took money in exchange for the rights to land that never existed. Delassus lived for 2 years in the Pittsburgh area and built an impressive house there that is described by others in the historical record. And to construct that house, it required that the family would sell part of their silverware collection. His wife, Domitille, became entrenched in this community and was seemingly very happy there with their large estate. She remained there for 2 years while he continued to explore the area. The important part of this stay, though, is that it was here that he met other influential French figures, including Bartholomew Tardiveau and Baron Francisco de Carondelet, important figures in the settlement of this area and St. Louis. Together, they formed grand plans for the settlement of Illinois country, exploitation of the natural resources, and, of course, the acquisition of land. They spent time in New Orleans together, planning and acquiring their land acquisitions, organizing their businesses, which included mining, distilling facilities, and commercial, agricultural, and milling across the region. They had grand plans for sort of a circuit or series of businesses that would serve the entire region. He acquired property that he quickly named New Bourbon for the royal family and began his permanent residency at New Bourbon in the summer of 1793. This is one of the maps that shows, that documents, thank you, I was hoping that there would be a pointer, Bob can show it. This is a 1797 map that shows St. Genevieve and New Bourbon. And it also on the bluffs says Luziers, the Luziers, which is approximately where the house was built on the bluffs above the river or the common field. This is an important document that does illustrate one of the three maps we'll see that illustrates where the Luzier property was located. So it shows, New Bourbon above, and it was labeled as Mont Genereux. This is a 1793 map that shows the old town of St. Genevieve in the lower center and New Bourbon above labeled as Mont Genereux. The Delassus property is not marked on this map, but the property noted as M. Dodge is located approximately where Delassus is indicated on other historical maps. Dodge was an American settler who moved to New Bourbon in the early 1790s and was granted 1,000 acres by Delassus in 1799. His name will come up again when the family must prove their ownership to the new federal government beginning in 1804. So yet another very early map that does indicate the presence of New Bourbon and of the Delassus property. Throughout this period, Delassus was sickly and his business plans were not materializing. He complained of malarial fevers and spent much of his time living with friends in St. Genevieve, who included Francois Valley and John Baptiste Valley. He wrote copiously of his experiences and of his new residence and the slow progress on construction. In March of 1794, he complained that they were still camped out and, quote, God only knows when our thatched cottage will be livable. That cottage was a poteau sur sol, or logs on a sill, single-story, six-room house of hewn white oak logs that was built on the bluff and that would have been the largest of the known vertical houses in the community. Six-room. Delassus' letters indicate the residence was built by individuals that were enslaved by Francois Valley and Jean-Baptiste Pratt. This was a time, though, when there was significant construction activity across St. Genevieve as the community remained in the process of moving to higher ground to avoid the regular and devastating flooding. Of course, after the 1785 significant flood, so we still have a period of 15 or 20 years where the community continued to move all of their resources, the last of which being the church itself. People built new, moved existing buildings, and rebuilt using older materials in the new town site. Nicolas de Fenils wrote in his 1803 manuscript that, quote, Monsieur de Luzier's house, which is located between New Bourbon and the Saline at a higher spot on the hills, enjoys the full scope of this seductive view. Indeed, this view is even more sweeping, for it extends off to the north. This elevation goes far toward making a visit there as healthy as it is agreeable. So quotes like this provide us with more information on the description and the location of the building, and it helps us to cement our understanding of what he built and where he built it. As I mentioned earlier, his businesses failed or were never started, and this financial struggle led him to focus on population growth in New Bourbon. He needed to attract people. They were in desperate need of doctors and other professionals. Delassus wanted a church of his own in the area, and of course they needed a population to support his vision. This was particularly a challenge when his preferred occupants of his new community were other French aristocrats fleeing persecution from the Revolution, many of whom he met during his time in Pennsylvania and Ohio while he was working his way toward Illinois country. His debt was so overwhelming at this time that he deeded his land to his son Camille in 1794, with the caveat that he and his wife could remain on the land for the rest of their days. This was likely even before his residence was fully completed. And over the course of the next several years, DeLassus received additional land grants to build out his vision of mining and milling across the area. And among those land grants was one in 1798 for a total of 1,000 arpents, on which that we know the house site is included. Ultimately, he could never attract the residents to support the population of New Bourbon. Eventually, he had to open up the area to less desirable settlers, in his opinion, and that included largely Americans and Protestants. So he was stacking the population with Americans and Protestants. And it's important to remember, as we study history from this era that this was French territory earlier and then Spanish territory. And it did not become American territory until after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 and the Lewis and Clark expeditions in 1804. And so the thought of Americans was not very desirable to DeLassus. He wrote about Americans that they were, quote, a new and vigorous people, hostile to all subjection, advancing and multiplying with prodigious rapidity. Which I think is so funny. It's like such a perfect quote from him, I think. It's obviously important to note this Spanish territory at the time and not governed by America. He was appointed commandant of New Bourbon in 1797 and undertook the census of New Bourbon at that time. This is likely one of the most important contributions he has to the historical record of the area. His census identified 93 households in New Bourbon, the Saline and Bois Brule together. It's, again, one of his most significant contributions. It provides the only description, really, of residents in the area, in New Bourbon. For in his census, each household was listed, the professions of those individuals were identified, people who were enslaved counted, and religions were documented. The population at that time in 1797 totaled 459 people, and among those were 2 free African-American women who were named Lisette and Rose. Lisette was 45 years old and lived in the village of New Bourbon, and Rose was between 58 and 60 years old and lived at the Saline. The census notes that, quote, they comport themselves well, cultivating the soil and raising animals. They will come back into play in this story shortly. DeLassus himself was the first listing in the census, and he listed himself as Pierre Charles d'Ault de Lessus et des Lusiers, French, Catholic, captain and commandant of his post, with 4 white males in the household, 3 white females in the household, 4 enslaved males, and 4 enslaved females. His household totaled 15. That level of description and documentation was provided for every household in the New Bourbon area. It's an incredibly valuable document and allows us to really know and understand and recognize the people who created his population. Finiels identified New Bourbon on his map, and in his description as he was writing about it, he noted about 480 residents with a lot of cattle, horses, and other agricultural products. So again, from different sources, we have different people documenting who were there, and those numbers coincide pretty closely with one another. So it gives us the indication that his census was fairly accurate. The 1793 map that showed Old Town St. Genevieve and the Dodge property marked approximately where DeLassus was, Dodge would be connected to DeLassus and later testify that he built a log cabin where a free African-American woman lived. The identity of this woman is not known, but again, these are multiple sources that link together the accuracy of the information we see in the historic record. Meanwhile, DeLassus and his wife Domitille continued to live an extravagant life and impressively building their debt. She noted that they lived a strangely changed life, and she brought a colorful oil painting of a Parisian festival noting a happier time that was hung with pride of place in their residence, which everybody's dying to find. Where did that painting go? We all want to see it. We don't know what the disposition of some of their possessions was. They did have an extensive library in their residence, upwards of 600 books. They continued to purchase lavish, expensive, and unnecessary items such as fabrics from Europe and Asia, delicacies like chocolate, olives, fruit preserves from Havana, mustard, and cheeses. This is all in the historic record. Their son Charles, or Carlos, was on constant attention, trying to manage and bail out his parents' indebtedness. And by 1801, the father owed the son thousands of dollars. Carlos became a high-ranking figure in the Spanish military and served as lieutenant governor of Louisiana in 1799. His political influence and seeming dedication to his family managed his parents' debt for the entirety of their lives spent in New Bourbon. When the American government took over in 1804, they required documentation of all previous French and Spanish land grants, as they were very happy to acquire as much land as possible. Carlos, the son, led a legal battle that took over 30 years to document their ownership of the land through a series of confusing concessions. As this slide indicates, from a letter between Delassus and Carondelet in April of 1793, Delassus states, "I'm proposing to build my residence, and where verily the principal families of farmers from Gallipolis will settle, will be called New Bourbon. This is part of a concession originally granted to Monsieur Francois Valley of St. Genevieve, who in turn ceded it to Sir Israel Dodge, who in turn ceded half of it to Monsieur Bartholomew Tardiveau, who in turn ceded it to me as a gift. I beg your excellency to approve and accept the primitive transmission of title for this concession." It's clear the confusing transactions and the desire of the American government then to acquire as much land as possible. These transactions, of course, made it easy for the American government, and this land was tied up in legal battles to prove the ownership into the 1830s. Both Delassus and his wife died in 1806 with little to no resources, and they left their children with massive debt. Delassus was 68 years old. They were both ironically buried in unmarked graves in the St. Genevieve Cemetery. Their sons, Camille and Charles, or Carlos, managed the estate. In 1826, another map, shown here, an excerpt from an 1826 map of the Mississippi River, prepared by Victor Collot, showed Old Town St. Genevieve, New Town St. Genevieve, that was labeled here as Gabory, New Bourbon, and Luziers near the bluff, but without a specific indication to the property's location. This is the last known reference to the Delassus property outside of the legal ownership battles. But again, it's a third map that shows continuously where the house was located on the bluff and not below the bluff where the standing structure is today. Okay, in 1834, the property was subdivided among the heirs, and Peter Pratt, who was the widower of Delassus' daughter, Marie Louise, received the parcel on which the current house stands. The legal battle ended in 1835 when the United States Supreme Court finally validated the Delassus Spanish land grants, clearing the ownership and title of the property to the family. In 1836, Pratt sells his holding to Martin Sweek for $200. In 1837, Sweek sold the property to Ichabod Sargent for $1,200. This series of transactions is what we believe is a very critical decade and critical time period for the history and recognition of the property that exists today. It's during this period that a new house is constructed at the bottom of the bluff, and there are no longer references to the stately home at the top of the bluff. Hopefully, future studies might confirm this, but what we know today through the historic record and through the evidence at the site is that the property that you see here in this photo, the circa 1890 photo, was likely built in the 1830s and likely about 1836. Possibly by Sweek himself. There is a significant increase in the value of the property from 1836 to 1837, when Sweek purchased it in $200 and then sold it the following year for $1,200. That indicates to us a significant and major improvement on the land. Likely, that is the house that you see here. Ichabod Sargent owned the property for about 18 years when, upon his death, the estate sold the residence to John D. Kern. Sargent was a physician in St. Genevieve, and his records indicate that he did not permanently live in this residence. The Kern family owns the property for more than 100 years, with family members living in the building well into the 1960s. Kern was a German born in Freudenberg, Baden, Germany in 1811 and died in New Bourbon in 1871. His estate inventory showed significant agricultural holdings and personal possessions. It was during this era that the property began to really thrive as an active and growing farmstead. The farm grew multiple agricultural resources. They built outbuildings, had different crops, and the family were particular lovers of their animals, especially mules. They had a huge collection of mules and loved to take photographs of them. In 1866, the newspaper conducted an interview with John Kern asking about his property, and Kern stated at that time, just following the Civil War, that, quote, the farm was originally improved by one of the Bourbon nobility who left France during the Revolution and sought refuge and safety on the then distant and almost unknown banks of the Mississippi. The spot of that house is marked on the top of the bluff with a magnificent view that's now in an orchard and marked by a pear tree. He said, sadly, that pear tree was later struck by lightning and no longer exists. The image here is likely the young August Kern family from around 1890. This is a really important image, in my opinion, because the house reflects a similar layout to that described as the one-story, six-room residence of DeLassus. This house has a six-room floor plan, is constructed of Poteau-sur-Sol construction, and is a relatively late date for this type of building. It's here I want to take a moment to extend a special thanks to Brenda Prince, who is a descendant of the Kern family. In doing some of this research, we were reaching out to different family members. She lives in Ohio and is a self-professed family archivist. And she said, yeah, I've got some family photos I'll share with you. And she visits St. Genevieve. She has family here still, a sister that still lives in town. I invited Bob to meet me down at the Park Services office to see what she had. And I think Bob and I were hyperventilating partly during some of it, going, oh, every time we saw a new image. Some of those images are incorporated here, but they are extensive and they really give us an insight into what seems to be the delightful nature of the Kern family. Lots of fun, candid photos of the children playing dress up, doing theater enactments on the land, portraits of their animals, their dogs, their cats, their mules, and a lot of just fun family activities. So thank you to Brenda Prince and the Kern family for sharing those images with us. They will be curated in the Park Service, at the Park Services office. It's here, copies of them, and the collection will be available for anybody to look at eventually. So we're working on that right now. Among those fascinating photos are two of these images. In 1903, we know that August Kern added a second story to the residence. It was documented by this caption in the St. Genevieve Herald, stating that it was one of the most commodious farmhouses in the vicinity. The addition was constructed by John Baumgartner, another hopeful avenue of research that might provide us some additional information on what Baumgartner may have found when he built the second story on top of the six-room vertical log building that is underneath here. If he had, it would be fascinating to know if he had business plans or made notes of his work, hopefully documented some insights. This is probably wishful thinking because I doubt it exists, but we can hope and we can continue to try. What's important to note here are the significant changes. So they added the second story, which is another, which was actually 3 rooms over the Poteau-sur-Sol structure. You can see the 1890s image on the bottom. Of note is the chimneys have been moved towards the inside of the house, so the fireplaces have been replaced. You can see slightly the lovely detail of the typical wire fence in front of the house, the 2-story front porch, which was probably the most impressive architectural detail of the residence, and then this sort of split stairway with the central landing and the stairs on either side, which we also see now at the Green Tree Tavern, a fairly typical feature on many of these buildings. But you can also note, it's a little harder to see, there's a large dark area underneath the front door. That was an opening into the lower level. That is visible on the 1890 photo. It's visible now on these 1903 photos. And you can begin to see how they subdivided the farmyard into different uses for family spaces as well as farm use. Okay. Here we're lucky enough to have the house under construction. Again, another likely photo taken during construction or soon after while they were fixing the fireplaces that were moved. And again, here you see the comparison to the 1890s structure where the chimneys were clearly on the outside walls, and now the chimney has moved to the center, or closer to the middle of the building, and a metal roof. This detail shows the family on the first floor porch with the double-sided stair like what's present at the Green Tree Tavern, as well as a view from the second story porch showing the river flooding. I don't know the date of these photos. I would imagine anybody, I know I took a picture of the stick that shows all the high water marks at the end of Main Street, thinking maybe we could link when these were taken, but likely shortly after the second story was added in 1903. The importance of these images show us in detail now the configuration of these porches, the railings, the banisters. We can clearly see the difference from the first floor porch to the second floor balcony because there was a different railing and a different balustrade on the second floor as opposed to the first floor. And it gives, you can still see this sort of beautiful expansive view that Delassus may have had, even though this structure is now on the bottom of the bluff and no longer on the top of the bluff. Family farming, all of the family farming activities are illustrated here, divided by the different fencing. You can see the large barn at the bottom that is no longer extant. And the farmyard on the top right shows a shadow of the house. So we can begin to identify where all of these outbuildings are. We also have, of course, physical evidence of the outbuildings. But these are great. You get a real sense of what the farm was like, what the landscape was like, what the ground cover was like. We don't always get a lot of candid photos like this in collections that we see. This is just one of the delightful candid shots of children playing with each other in a wheelbarrow. The brother is pushing the sister in the wheelbarrow, and the chicken is striking quite a pose in the coop doorway. It looks like it was staged. But all of their photos have these great, just humorous images of their animals or dogs are playing. And I thought that one was particularly delightful. Another thing of interest, and again, the different trails you can go down. The photo on the right is a pecan tree in the common field. And if you look closely at the bottom, you can see a very tall ladder that's going from the ground up to the tree. And if you look in the tree, there are two men standing in the tree. Also on the ground, a cover is a series of cloths. I asked Bob about this too, and we think this is a pecan tree, and they were harvesting pecans. The men were climbing this enormous tree. They had these huge sticks, and they were shaking the branches and getting the pecans onto the cloth and then gathering up the cloth. It's fascinating to see this because their harvest, it really gives us a first-person point of view of how useful many of these harvests were. Among some of the other things they grew were some grapevines. They had extensive fruit orchards, a huge vegetable garden, but pecans are one of the staple crops for the Kern family. They bartered with pecans, harvested thousands of pounds per year, as is documented in the estate records of both John Kern and August Kern. And Brenda Prince says she remembers coming here, spending summers with her aunties in this house, and going down to the land in the common field and picking pecans. So it's been fairly recent. We know this because there is an example. This shows a page from a medical book from John D. Kern's estate, and it notes that in 1869 he paid for medical services with a bushel of pecans valued at $4 and 2 geese valued at $1. It's also notable in this same book that they bartered in wine, cabbage, rhubarb, and other geese and waterfowl. I love this one from August Kern. No picking pecans allowed and no auto traffic on my property. Keep out or you'll be punished by law. That is an ad that Bob shared with me from 1935. August dies in 1939, and the property came into the possession of his surviving children, where eventually his daughters, Nettie, Rachel, and Edna, would live in the house together until their deaths in the late 1960s. The farm buildings continued to decline over the years in the mid-1980s, when in 1985, the Historic American Building Survey sent a team of professionals to record and survey the house. Soon thereafter, dendrochronology was done that identified the trees used in the vertical logs were felled in 1793, which gives us another link to the date of Delassus. We know his house was under construction through his letters in 1793. Later in the 1990s, archaeological excavations were done through Southeast Missouri State and Murray State at the house site. Their findings confirm a construction date of about the 1830s for this residence. There's no earlier pottery or ceramic, china, or glassware were found on this site that could date this house to a period earlier than the 1830s. However, it is notable that china from the Delassus period has been found on the top of the bluff, where the house, we believe, was located. And aerial photographs, historic aerial photographs, may indicate a stain in the earth, in the soil, that could be a possible location of the residence. Damage to the house due to floodwaters was not unusual, as it has withstood every major high water event since its construction. Here, the photo on the right illustrates the height of the 1973 floodwaters, clearly showing the sheds and barns underwater. And the 1985 image was from the Historic American Building Survey. We call it HABS for short, for the HABS recordation of the property. It's looking generally southwest. The main facade of the house here with the double porch is still in place, though the railings and the balustrade are no longer present. The woodshed and the chicken house are visible, as is the cistern in the right foreground. Many of the water resources, wells and cisterns, are still present at the house today. So we'll walk through what the house looks like, its evolution over the next 20 years, and you can see how it's deteriorated over time. These 1985 photos from the HABS recordation do clearly show that the porch was still present on the side and back of the house where the kitchen is located, but you can see that it is beginning to get fairly overgrown. Okay. This is inside that porch where you can see one of the cisterns located for family use. It's interesting to note, too, that in the Kern family photos, we have a lot of detailed images of these areas and how they use them. And, you know, big wash tubs hanging on the outside of the house and other functional resources that are scattered about the yard that the family used. Okay. Again, in this 1993 photo, yep, that's the one. So it's looking from the common field, taken shortly before the utility shed was removed. And then, of course, the image on the right is undated. This is more of an aerial view. We think we have an idea when this was taken, but not exactly sure. But you can see the relationship of the buildings from the historic era and the way they were looking at the time in the 1990s when things were beginning to, when their outbuildings were beginning to be removed. In 1995, the house was further deteriorating. Archaeological excavations at this time were being considered, and the residence was purchased by Dr. Susan Flotter, who in turn donated it to the Missouri Department of Natural Resources for preservation. Again, this is at a time when the house was, I would say, rediscovered. I asked Brenda Prince and the family, did you always know what the house was? Did you always know that there was this 1830s vertical log building underneath your house? And she said, oh yeah, we always knew. It was never rediscovered by us. She's like, we just didn't figure out why all of a sudden in 1985 everybody was interested in the house again. Seemed like everybody in town maybe, or obviously many people in town who appreciated the architecture, I'm not sure what precipitated it, but recognized what was there underneath the building. So the Missouri Department of Natural Resources acquires the property through donation from Susan Flatter in 1995. And again, you can see in this series of photos, in this photo from about 2000, the front porch is completely gone at this point, okay? And this photo is looking generally west after the porches have been removed. You can see the cistern still here in the front of the property. In 2021, the property was acquired by the National Park Service and incorporated into the St. Genevieve National Historical Park. And that's where we came in, and we started to do these studies. So let's take a look at the inside. We've been talking about this vertical log house. Here's the vertical log house. The series of archaeological investigations, as I mentioned earlier, found lots of resources associated with this property, none of which dated to any earlier, at least in any significant fashion, to 1830s for a permanent occupation of this property. But you can clearly see, here are the vertical logs. This is the condition of the interior of the house. This is probably about a year ago, I think, when we were in and taking some photographs. There's a lot of study that could be done here to figure out what happened with these logs. Especially around doors and windows where they may have been cut, they may have been removed. How does it look the way it does here? Okay, Bob, next one. You can see some of the logs that are placed at an angle, very similar to many of the other, all of you who've been through all of the vertical log buildings. This is a similar construction that you see in many of the properties across St. Genevieve. Okay. Here at the bottom, it's a little hard to see in this image, but the Park Service has done minimal work to the property to date, except to shore up the exterior walls to ensure that they don't collapse. Their biggest goal to date is the essentially mothballing and preservation of the property as it stands so that it does not continue to deteriorate further. Again, here you can clearly see the vertical logs, the extent of the vertical logs, and the size of this property. This is an enormous vertical log house, 6-room vertical log house. The 6 rooms are still clearly visible in this residence, okay? And then of course you have the later additions like the stairway to the 2nd floor that would have been added by the Kern family as part of their 2nd level renovation. Okay, so wrapping it all up, here's the questions. What do we know and what do we not know? As we try to bring all of this information together, we are pulling information from the historical record from the DeLassus family as well as from the Kern family. We know that there are 3 maps. This is just another great Kern family photo of some of the flooding from their 2nd floor balcony. They've got these amazing photos out over the common field. There are 3 maps that illustrate the location of DeLassus' original house, sited on the bluff above the location of the existing building. These date from 1797, 1803, and 1826. We know there is archaeological reports that document the artifacts dating to the 1830s. We also have the historical records that show the increase in value of the property from 1836 to 1837, from $200 to $1,200. All of this leads us to a construction date in the 1830s, along with other physical details of the house itself. Our unanswered questions. Is this the DeLassus house? I invite everybody to provide their input. This property is an enigma. It provides nothing but questions. I do believe that there is a strong link to understanding what happened in the 1790s through about 1830s, when we know that there was significant activity on this property. And then the question is, what did they do with the DeLassus house? We think it was vacant after DeLassus passed away and his wife. His family was no longer living there. It likely stood vacant on the top of the bluff for 20 years, maybe 30 years. So did Sweek then use the raw materials from that house to build this house? Did he move the house? These are our conclusions and suppositions. Was the house cobbled together from other buildings that were, or building materials that were available in St. Genevieve at the time, particularly in the 1790s? And do we think that the vertical log portion of this property is a direct link to the DeLassus property on the top of the bluff? We don't know definitively. I believe yes. I believe there's a strong connection, and I believe the circumstantial connection of the size of these logs and the size of this property it's very coincidental, and we're seeing lots of coincidences that continue to line up. So my thought is, yes, this is a direct link. Whether or not we can ever prove that or not is, your guess is as good as my guess. But what I do know is that the house, as it stands today, even in its deteriorated condition, is valuable. It has national significance, not only for its architectural merit, for the construction, the 1830s vertical log construction, but also because the land is a direct link to New Bourbon. We know that it's a direct link to New Bourbon, and we also believe there is a significant amount of archaeology that could still be done both at the site and above on the bluff that could provide us with additional documentation. There's also something to be said about retaining this house as a relic or as a ruin. We don't know what the Park Service's plans are. They don't know what their plans are. And our hope is that our study could at least provide them with sufficient information to maintain the stability of the house, preserve it in its current condition, so they can thoughtfully plan and prepare what they may do with the property. They may never renovate it. They may leave it as a relic like this so that all of us could go in and look at it and understand these changes over time and see what used to be what we think was a house in New Bourbon. Okay. All of this information was pulled together from a variety of historical resources, documents, family photos, narratives, legal documents, and the fascinating thing is they all seem to stack up in a manner that illustrates some very strong linkages through the historical record. I would encourage you all to look at your family photos. We have so often will ask for people, ask if you have historic photos, and many people say, no, we don't have any old photos. We just have these old family pictures. Well, as you can see, these old family pictures have incredible value for researchers like us to try and understand what happened at these properties over the years. So I would invite your questions, your comments, and your thoughts on whether you think this is the DeLassus house. Thank you. One last thing, anybody who wants to learn more about DeLassus, much of his information is from Karl Eckberg's book, A French Aristocrat in the American West. He, of course, is a very thorough researcher, but he also translated all of these letters from French. So it's right, he's got his indexes, all of his letters and documents, including the census that he did. So this is a really valuable book for anybody who wants to learn more about DeLassus specifically. So thank you.
I know that Carl likes to argue about whether it's Kern DeLassus or DeLassus, but he always says, regardless, this is a very important structure to keep. It was the largest vertical log house in the area, and for that fact alone, we've got to preserve it.
And it remains the largest vertical log house. And a vertical log house built at a very late date, 1830s, late 1830s, that was just not the construction method they were using. So why did they do that in 1830s?
Well, we do have a couple.
Oh, well, okay, a couple, but not as common certainly as it would have been in the 1790s, which does lead you to believe that it was either salvaged or that six-room configuration is retained. It is exceptionally valuable. Yes.
Do we know anything about Martin Sweek, his background, his cultural identity that would lead him to take the logs from this old house on the hill and reconstruct a vertical French-style house? Lower, I presume it was the same property.
It is the same property, yes.
Right.
It's the parcel on which we know the DeLassus house is located.
So, do we know anything about him?
A little. We didn't do necessarily a deep dive into Sweek, but I would say Bob may know more that I would liken Sweek to maybe an early developer, where he was known to buy and upgrade and sell properties. So he only owned this property for, not quite 2 years, 18 months, something like that. And that improvement, that significant financial improvement is important.
Part of the White Acres, this is Grand National Historic Site, part of that house is the vertical log cabin.
I'm sorry, which site was that?
Ulysses S.
Oh, the
Grant.
Ulysses S. Grant, yes.
Part of it is a vertical log house that was moved from another site, added on when Dent got the property. And the logs were felled in 1828. So that surprised me that they were building French vertical log cabins even then.
Yeah.
So it
Yeah.
kind of correlates with the 1830s.
Right.
as well.
Yeah, and like I said, the logs were felled in 1793. That we know, and there could be more dendrochronology done at the site to do a bigger sampling.
The only Sweek that I know of, that he and his wife died within a week of each other and left like 11 or 13 kids.
I was going to ask you that question.
Yeah, I have
that's
to go back and
very
see if
good.
that
Okay.
was Martin.
Yeah.
Martin and Caroline.
Yes. You had a question?
I do have a question. It looks like, is it common for those plateau en terre houses to have those diagonal cross pieces and horizontal cross pieces like that?
So this is a poteau sur sol, and that's vertical logs on a beam or on a horizontal piece. And that angled piece is sort of a stabilization piece. And if you can clearly see it at Green Tree, it's exposed there, and they talk about it in their interpretation. So yes, that was common.
Is that fairly common? Because it's also fairly common in German clockwork too.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And so,
Yes.
so
Very
I'm wondering, it seemed as though, looking at the log arrangement on that house, it was a bit of a hybrid between I don't know enough about that.
Well, with the German Fachwerk, it would have been that it's similar, more half timbering, where you would have, at least in my understanding, have more of the wood framing with infill, whereas this is really more vertical log. If you go to Green Tree Tavern, on the outside of the building, on the patio, or on the porch going around, the gallery going around, you can clearly see the same construction type of these angled logs. We know that a lot of these houses were built by enslaved labor, free forced labor of actually what were clearly very skilled people at their craft. And the construction method is similar in a lot of these buildings that date to within 4 years of each other or so, 1790 to 95-ish.
I think Ernest commonly calls those wind bracing, because you see them on all four corners, both directions.
Yep.
And at the top beam, there is horizontal bracing also.
Yeah. That's why, like, if we could find notes from when that second story was added, if people know what that top looked like. I mean, there's a lot of information that could be gleaned from a more detailed study of the building, and that's what we're trying to do through this process. I don't know, we won't be doing what we might say is selective demolition, where we might remove a portion of a wall, especially on the upper level or floor, to look down in there. Won't go that far, but try to understand.
Not a question, but a comment. I've often driven by there and wondered, what the hell is that?
I'm so glad you said that. This is the perfect don't judge a book by its cover thought process. And I think the more people know about it, obviously, the more you'll appreciate that this is not just a dilapidated, rundown farmhouse that's sitting on a field. Yes.
I know it's a project, it's a work in progress. What's the, I guess, the goal of it? What's it going to look like when it's finished? And when might that be?
We don't, well, what we're working on is a report. It's just a big document.
So it's a way.
Sorry. It's a document, and it will be within the next year. It will be completely finished, and those documents are being published online at the Park Service, so they'll be available for everybody to see. There will be some information that's redacted, some archaeological information, things like that, so specific locations aren't provided, but the majority of the reports will be available online. Recommendations section, that's a really good question. For the Kern House, the DeLassus-Kern House, many of the recommendations are stabilization, enclosing all weather issues, and making recommendations for thoughts and interpretive thoughts for the future, largely to help inform everybody who says, what the heck is this big rundown building that's just sitting here with a Park Service sign? What is it? Now it's fairly dangerous to be in. The floors are not stable, etc. So they don't want a lot of people out there. So it's a good question, and the question right now is we don't know, and I don't think the Park Service knows yet. What they do know is that it has exceedingly important historical value, and it's worth preserving. So that's the baseline.
Thank you.
Thank you.